Okay, so this is Jonathan Angulo on June 20th, 2024 at 7:34 Eastern Standard Time, conducting an interview for the A Global Oral History of PEPFAR project. To begin, could you start off by introducing yourself and establishing your connection to PEPFAR and what years did you work for or in partnership with the project?
My name is Kristen Silverberg, and I worked in the Bush administration all 8 years. I worked for the first 4 years in the White House, and my initial job in the White House was as a policy advisor, as a special assistant to the president in the chief of staff's office, working for Josh Bolten.
Excellent, perfect. Please briefly tell us about yourself and your family. Where and when were you born? Where did you go to school, etc.?
I was born in Alpine, Texas, although I grew up in Austin. I went to college. I graduated from Harvard College and the University of Texas School of Law. And after graduating from law school, I moved to DC to clerk for a federal judge.
Perfect. Please tell us a little bit about your career background.
I practiced law for a couple years, and I clerked for 2 federal judges, for David Sentel from the DC Circuit and Clarence Thomas on the US Supreme Court. And as my clerkship was ending, my home state governor, George Bush, announced that he was running for president. So at the end of my clerkship, I moved home to Austin to work on the campaign and the policy staff for Josh Bolten, who later became the deputy chief of staff for policy in the White House.
Okay, excellent. And again, this might just be like a yes or no question, but how did you end up coming to work on PEPFAR specifically that addressed issues of HIV?
After President Bush was elected, he asked Josh Bolten, who had been the campaign policy director, to be the White House chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff for policy in the White House. And Josh hired 2 policy staffers to work for him in that capacity, me and a colleague named Joel Kaplan. And Joel and I basically split up the policy world, and part of my portfolio was health, including global health. And so when the discussions of a big administration initiative on HIV/AIDS, beginning with a mother-to-child transmission initiative, when that started, I was assigned to work on that project.
Okay. And what was your sense of the pandemic when you were briefed about this public health project?
I certainly had a sense of the terrible toll that HIV/AIDS was taking around the world, particularly in Africa. I don't think I had a good sense of the opportunities for treatment. I don't think I had a good sense of how far treatment had come, and I don't think I had a good sense of the ways that the U.S. could step up to address it. I don't think I understood that until much farther along in the process.
Okay. And what was your particular knowledge about Africa before you came to work with PEPFAR and the Bush administration?
I think it was pretty superficial, to be honest. It was later in the administration. The campaign had policy advisors, including Dr. Rice, who were focused on Africa as a real opportunity, that, as an area where there was a lot of potential for growth, where it was strategically important. But I don't think I had a strong sense of that until we really were deep into the process around PEPFAR.
Okay. So the next question is about the broad strokes of PEPFAR. How would you describe PEPFAR, and what would you highlight as the program's biggest achievements and maybe failures or setbacks?
I'd say that PEPFAR is a great example of not only U.S. compassion, but competence. The American people have lots and lots of examples of the government falling short, spending tax dollars in a way that isn't effective and efficient, or struggling to deal with emergencies. And PEPFAR was a great example of the U.S. Applying compassion to, sorry, I took it. Let me do that one again.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to ask it again? Or?
It's up to you.
Okay. Yeah, we can go ahead and
Okay.
You can continue.
PEPFAR is a great example of not only U.S. compassion, but U.S. competence, the American people have a lot of examples of times when the government hasn't spent tax dollars effectively or has really struggled to handle an emergency situation. And PEPFAR was a great example that the U.S. can take on great challenges and do them effectively. So I think it was an example of rigor, of ambition, but also focused, targeted ambition, and was just an example of the things that the U.S. can do around the world to solve great problems.
Okay, perfect. So the next couple of questions will particularly focus on the 2000 campaign as the policy advisor in the Bush campaign. So tell us how you informed the campaign about global public health policies.
I didn't work on global health issues on the campaign. I was one of 15 or 20 members of the policy team and was assigned to different projects. I did work on domestic health issues, and really that's consistent with the way that we thought about the candidates, about the governor's policy agenda. During the 2000 campaign, I think we all assumed that this would be a domestically focused administration, and a lot of his initiatives coming out of the campaign were focused on addressing domestic problems. So he had a big initiative on Medicare reform, he had an initiative on Social Security reform, how to shore up that program. He had proposed a major education initiative, No Child Left Behind. He had proposed major tax reform. He had an initiative on faith-based programs, but that was really the focus, is how do we strengthen the U.S. at home. I think it was a surprise to everyone how much of the administration ended up focusing on global issues, but of course in part that was driven by a lot of the issues that came out of 9/11.
Okay. So with that being said, can you tell us about your role in forming the policy campaign objectives of faith-based policies?
One of the real principles that drove President Bush, and you see this throughout the campaign, is this belief in human dignity, the idea that you shouldn't leave anyone behind. And you see that in a lot of the things he was talking about. He had a prisoner reentry program that was, we now call it second chance hiring, but about helping the formerly incarcerated reintegrate into society. He had No Child Left Behind, which was his education reform program, which was about making sure that kids from all walks of life have the opportunity for a great education. And so a lot of what he was talking about in the 2000 campaign, including sometimes with pastors and faith-based groups, was about how to marshal these armies of compassion to help address core issues. I think he had a deep conviction that the way that you would deal with people, that some of the most compelling examples of compassion would come from groups who are motivated by deep faith. And so he worked hard to make sure that government resources and programs and partnerships were available to faith-based groups, as well as to some of the longstanding government providers. And I think you see this belief in human dignity. I think you see that really play out in his approach to PEPFAR, that so much of the community had given up on people who were already infected with HIV/AIDS, and part of what I think persuaded him to take on this massive treatment program was the view that really we needed to be supportive of giving people a second chance at life.
Okay. And how did that you already kind of hinted at it, but how did that intersect with public health policy domestically, talking about something like AIDS?
I think there was a view, there had been a lot, obviously there were lots and lots of groups who were working on HIV/AIDS issues domestically and around the world, but I don't think anyone had contemplated the idea of a treatment program that would be launched with this scale and ambition. And I think it was one, the president's core conviction in human dignity and the idea that you don't leave people behind, combined with some incredibly compelling stories of people who are working on the ground. So scientists who could talk about the unbelievable technological developments that were enabling effective treatment, but also people, Peter Mugeni and others, who were working in Africa, who were delivering treatment to rural areas, who could talk to him about what was possible. So I think it was this conviction, this kind of deep faith and belief in human dignity combined with some rigor in terms of science and hardcore implementation that really made PEPFAR possible.
Okay, perfect. So now that we've talked a little bit about the campaign, we're transitioning into, the role that you had from 2001 to 2003 as special assistant to the president in the White House Chief of Staff. So in 2002, President Bush told Bolton about his intention to do more on AIDS. Tell us about how you worked with the administration to craft a global AIDS policy.
The work on HIV/AIDS really began in 2001 when President Bush decided to make the founding contribution to the Global Fund. After that, the White House began a process of thinking about what more there was to do, and President Bush asked Gary Edson, who was a Deputy National Security Advisor, to lead that effort. Gary ran a very rigorous process to develop this mother-to-child initiative, and the idea behind that was, could you use some of this nevirapine and make it available to more mothers as a way of preventing transmission to their children? So in June of 2002, President Bush had a Rose Garden ceremony, and he announced this major mother-to-child initiative. It was $500 million, which at the time I think exceeded what was then the entire United States budget for global HIV/AIDS efforts. So it was really kind of an extraordinary thing in and of itself. And immediately after that meeting, Josh convened some of us in his office, including Tony Fauci, who was the head of NIAID, the NIH Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, and said that President Bush really wants to do more, that he thinks this is an important and compelling area for the U.S. to lead. And so he asked Dr. Fauci to come up with a proposal, basically, for the White House. And he told him, think big. I remember him saying, which was very surprising for Josh, for the moment, pretend like money is no object, which I remember being shocked that he would actually tell an agency head to come up with a proposal without regard to the cost. And at the time, we were all persuaded that Dr. Fauci would come back with a vaccine initiative. He was the head of the institute that was leading vaccine research. In Washington, it's very unusual for someone to propose an initiative that sends money to somebody else's department. So we were 100% certain that Dr. Fauci would come back with a kind of a vaccine moonshot. And of course, what he came back with a few weeks later was this idea for an ambitious treatment, care, and prevention program.
Okay, perfect. And you already mentioned some of the people involved, but can you tell us about any more of the major players, and were some of them, how were they made aware about designing PEPFAR?
Well, Josh, the lead was Josh Bolton, who was Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. He later became the White House Chief of Staff and of course did a stint as OMB Director. He had been the campaign policy head. He's incredibly smart, very hardworking, universally respected, and I think that his role and his leadership in it is part of what persuaded President Bush that it was a good idea, because Josh applied so much rigor to everything he does that it was, I think the president had confidence that it would work effectively. Gary Edson was the Deputy National Security Advisor for Econ, so he was a joint report to the National Security Advisor and the Director of the National Economic Council. Gary is rigorous, I would say, great attention to detail. I first worked with Gary on the 2000 campaign. I was helping him put together President Bush's debate books, and we were turning a new draft of a debate book at 2 a.m. one night, and Gary was explaining to me that he wanted the 3-hole punches done in a particular way. So I would say Gary pays a lot of attention to detail. There was Jay Lefkowitz, who was started out in the administration as the lawyer at OMB and then later became the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor. Jay is a consensus builder. He really works, is very creative, high energy and dynamic, and I think was really good at kind of bringing people around a common point of view. There was Robin Cleveland, who was the person in charge at OMB of the foreign aid funds, so worked for Mitch Daniels, who was then the OMB director. Robin is really tough. She's very, very smart, very tough. When I later went to Iraq in 2003, as I was basically on a secondment from March to October, and when I got to Iraq, Iraqis used to say, do you think that Robin Cleveland will agree to this program? I mean, she really had a reputation kind of around the world for being really tough and rigorous.
Okay, awesome. So what were the Bush administration's concerns in pushing for this?
I'm sorry, can I just covered the White House staff, but I probably should say a word about the NIH team as well.
Yeah.
So obviously Dr. Fauci, who's well known, this just incredible world-renowned scientist. But one of the interesting things is throughout the project, he really dug in and rolled up his sleeves. I remember him sitting in Josh's office with me editing fact sheets before the rollout. I mean, he really kind of saw this as a just an incredible opportunity for NIH and for HIV/AIDS programs. And he really, I think, made an incredible contribution. And then Mark Diebold, who was one of his team members at NIH, who was in some ways the really father of the initiative, who I think came up with the original concept behind the treatment, care, and prevention program, and of course later went on to lead it and be a great advocate for it around the world.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for elaborating. So what were the Bush administration's concerns in pushing for this new program rather than working through existing global structures?
I think the Global Fund was still relatively new, and untested. And it wasn't exactly clear what the other kind of multilateral partners, how much they would contribute. But I'd say the big issue with the multilateral bodies was a fear about inertia, about bureaucracy, that they would be too slow, that they wouldn't be up to it, and that they would be too stuck in kind of existing ways. I mean, fundamentally, the case that President Bush made to Congress on the program was this is going to be a huge commitment of U.S. resources. I mean, $15 billion seems sort of quaint now, but at the time that was just, a massive, massive U.S. financial contribution. But that we would do it in a way that was rigorous, that had set clear targets, that measured results, that was able to adjust when necessary, and that could move with some speed. I mean, we wanted to be realistic about how quickly we could roll the money out, but also to move quickly. And we did not have confidence that multilateral bodies would be up to that. And so the end result was to say that most of the U.S. commitment would be done unilaterally through PEPFAR, through these programs. I should say unilateral is the word we would sometimes use. It's not exactly right in the context of PEPFAR. because one of the core principles of PEPFAR was country ownership, that the money would be spent in a way that really was driven by the home country. And so it was in that sense a very bilateral approach where we were working with the target countries to develop the programs, but that the funding was US provided. So most of PEPFAR was administered in this bilateral way, but we remained strong contributors to the multilateral programs, and in fact used those US contributions to try to encourage other countries, particularly countries in the G7 at the time, to really step up to the plate.
Absolutely. And can you tell us about your role working with Josh to make sure that this succeeded and crossed the hurdle?
So as you know, the president announced the new initiative in his 2003 State of the Union. He worked, and the White House worked, to secure congressional support. I didn't participate in most of that. As I mentioned, I was on secondment to Iraq for most of those times. So I came back in October of that year and replaced Jay Lefkowitz as the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor. For different reasons, Josh had made the decision to have the PEPFAR program, which had been placed at the State Department, report into the White House through the Domestic Policy Council rather than the National Security Council. And so I was the principal interlocutor of Randy Tobias, who was then the head of PEPFAR, in my role at DPC. And that was most of the work of administering the funds, of tracking implementation, of working with international partners. Most of that was done out of the PEPFAR office, but of course the White House is there to make sure that the office had the resources it needs, that it had support from other agencies, so it wasn't stuck in any kind of bureaucratic debates, that if it needed attention from the White House or any support, that we were there to give it. So most of my role was to check with Randy on how we were doing an implementation and to help him address any hurdles or obstacles.
Okay, perfect. So can you tell us about, the stakeholders influencing these policies, particularly in 2004?
Well, I would say our internal stakeholders, there were lots of agencies that were involved. Obviously, HHS, even though it didn't immediately, administer the program, was very involved. So especially the international office at HHS played a big role. Secretary Thompson was a great supporter and advocate for the program. Lots of the White House entities, both Domestic Policy Council, National Security Council, as I mentioned, OMB, were all actively involved. So CDC played a big role. So there were a lot of internal stakeholders. There were lots of external stakeholders there was at the time when we rolled out PEPFAR, when President Bush announced it in the State of the Union, it was very closely held. It was a big surprise to lots of people until almost immediately before the announcement. So we didn't involve a lot of stakeholder groups in the development of it, other than bringing in some experts and swearing them to secrecy to help develop the program. It really wasn't kind of developed with a wide group, but once it was rolled out, then of course there were a huge number of stakeholders, all the groups that work on HIV/AIDS issues and now could become program partners. Obviously are, the partners in Africa, so the governments with whom we'd be working most closely, our G7 partners, other countries who we would expect to contribute to the Global Fund or to other HIV/AIDS efforts. So there are a massive number of stakeholders. The members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. It was really interesting because this was an area that, in part because of the way that we designed the program, enjoyed support from both sides of the aisle, both from groups on the left who had worked on HIV/AIDS programs for a long time, evangelical groups who'd been involved. So anyway, it became a really kind of critical effort to make sure everybody that we were available to listen to concerns from any of the stakeholders.
Okay, perfect. So what new opportunities did the passage of PEPFAR help create for the Bush administration, maybe leading into the 2004 election?
I don't know. I mean, President Bush came out of the 2000 campaign with a number of initiatives that required bipartisan support. One of the best examples is No Child Left Behind, which he passed with Senator Kennedy's strong support. We had worked, I remember in the early months of the administration, we had worked on a Patients' Bill of Rights initiative, and that was, mostly the Bush administration working with Senator Kennedy and Senator Edwards and Senator McCain. So President Bush he'd had a really strong bipartisan record in Texas, working closely, particularly with the Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock. And so it was part of his just DNA to reach across the aisle. And so in a sense, this was just consistent with that. It was part of our kind of the fabric of the administration, is that we were always looking for partners on the other side of the aisle. So in that sense, it was very consistent. It was also consistent, I think, for him to, when he campaigned in 2000, he campaigned with a lot of Black pastors who found common ground with him, particularly around the kind of his approach to compassionate conservatism and and faith-based programs. And PEPFAR created additional opportunities for that as well. But there's sometimes in the writing about PEPFAR and the histories of PEPFAR, there's sometimes this underlying implication that it was done for political reasons. And I always think that's a really strange approach. There was no political pressure at all on President Bush to do this program. As I said, there was some support from evangelical groups, but there's very little pressure on him from any kind of political actor to do it. This was a program that was a moral imperative, but it was not a political imperative at all. So anyway, I think it created opportunities for him to do things that he was already inclined to do, which is work in a bipartisan way and work with kind of partners from, all over the political spectrum to achieve goals.
Okay, sure. So next, few questions are going to talk about, your role as the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. So, what is the role of that position, and how did your role in PEPFAR inform your goals for the assignment?
I moved over in 2005. So in 2004, immediately after the president was reelected, I moved from Domestic Policy Council back to the Chief of Staff's office as a policy advisor, and I was active in that role. I was active, remained active on the kind of White House support for PEPFAR. But then in 2005, I moved to the State Department as an Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs, which is the bureau at the State Department that manages multilateral issues, particularly through the United Nations. So the Bureau of International Organization Affairs oversees U.S. role at 47 different UN entities. So I played a role in that, in both administering some of the multilateral funds. As I mentioned, PEPFAR was mostly a bilateral program between the U.S. and our PEPFAR partners, but we also, as part of PEPFAR, President Bush had committed to continuing major contributions to the Global Fund and all the other multilateral entities. So partly I played a role at the State Department in overseeing those and making sure that funds were being spent effectively. And of course, played a role in helping to energize some of our multilateral partners, so other developed nations that should be major contributors to the fight against HIV/AIDS. That was a real challenge at times. there was some, I think, resistance sometimes on the part of other countries to step up. And so a big part of what the Bush administration was doing was helping to make the case to some of our partners for major contributions.
Okay, perfect. Can you tell us a little bit more about, like those challenges and the successes in trying to convince, some of the countries to support, the fight against HIV and AIDS after passage of PEPFAR? I
think, there were a few tools the administration used. One was for example, the President Bush or the U.S. chaired the 2004 G8, which was in Sea Island, which was when the G8 rolled out a major vaccine initiative. And sometimes Faryar Shirzad, who I think was the Sherpa, I think he was in the Gary Edson role by then, would be the best person to talk about this. But I think sometimes those international convenings, there's a lot of pressure on countries to come up with important deliverables when developed countries get together. And that one was a really important meeting because a lot of African leaders were invited to it. So I think that sometimes the U.S. would use those convenings as a way to try to get other countries to come to the table with contributions. And that's something that, that Faryar Shirzad exercised a lot of leadership in that area.
Okay, perfect. And were there any conversations about PEPFAR during deliberations in the UN in particular?
There were both at the UN and sometimes at international conferences. So both. I think that generally, I think the international community was amazed by and the U.S. commitment. As I said, it was a big surprise, not only to domestically but globally. I think it was an enormous surprise to a lot of countries that we made that kind of commitment. And so I think on the whole, there was really widespread support. But of course, there were always criticisms as well, either criticisms that the U.S. was doing too much bilaterally and ought to have made a bigger percentage of PEPFAR as a contribution to some of the multilateral bodies. There were occasionally criticisms about some decisions that we made in implementation of PEPFAR. So at one point, PEPFAR had announced that it would not be buying so-called generic drugs, so drugs that had not been through the full FDA approval process. They might be approved in another country, in India or South Africa or someplace where they were actually produced, but hadn't gone through the full FDA approval process. And it was controversial at the time because a lot of people said you can buy a lot more drugs if you buy cheaper Indian generics rather than drugs that are fully approved in the US. But there was a concern, on the other hand, that these are drugs that are being administered to people who are immunocompromised, so you really don't want to cut corners. So what we ended up doing in response to that was developing a new kind of rapid approval process at the FDA to get kind of special approval of drugs to give PEPFAR additional options. So sometimes there were criticisms that we listened to and tried to address.
Okay. And, now that we've kind of talked about some of those things, the next ones are just going to be some concluding questions. So reflecting on your work with PEPFAR, how do you feel about it?
I think it's just an incredible example of what the U.S. can do in terms of both using our resources in a way that can solve just unbelievable humanitarian tragedy, but also do it in a way that's competent and focused and targeted and effective and that produces benefits for the U.S. I mean, I think it's a great example of, in the U.S., the kinds of, long-term effects of PEPFAR, both in terms of helping to revitalize Africa economically, saving lives, providing care for orphaned kids, preventing new disease. I mean, it's all of that is something that ultimately benefits the American people by creating more stable countries, by creating an economically growing region, all of those things. And I think a lot of the promise that you see in Africa now, I think you can attribute to the fact that the U.S. helped to turn the tide against this terrible disease. So I think of it as having PEPFAR as, this incredible program in and of its own right, but it also has this legacy of demonstrating the ways that you can do foreign aid in a way that's sustainable and really, benefits the American taxpayer.
And what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of PEPFAR? Whose voice is missing the most in the stories of PEPFAR?
Well, as I said earlier, I think sometimes there's an implication that PEPFAR, there was some political purpose or some political strategy behind PEPFAR, and I didn't see any hint of that in the development. I think it was the program, I think President Bush pursued it fundamentally for moral reasons, because he thought it was a moral imperative. I think he was persuaded by some of his conversations with Dr. Rice that Africa was a really important region, strategically and economically in other ways. So I think he saw that element as too. I don't think he saw or even thought about a domestic political benefit at all. So I think that's point is frequently misunderstood. And I think one of the things that's sometimes missing from the debate is, and that's frequently missing from U.S. debates, about foreign aid, is the on-the-ground perspective. What are U.S. tax dollars actually doing on the ground? One of the most important parts of the development of PEPFAR was when people who were doing on-the-ground work came in to the White House, were sort of sworn to secrecy, and then answered questions for hours about the programs. Would it be possible to administer these funds in rural areas? Is it possible to commit people to treatment regimens that require them to be rigorous on time? How do you follow up and ensure success? How do you track your data? And all of that was done with a lot of guidance and advice from people with real world experience. And so anyway, I think that discussion, what does it actually mean on the ground? One of the most important experiences for me in the administration was when I traveled to see some PEPFAR sites with Mark Dyball, with our colleague Mike Gerson, who was the president's speechwriter, but also a great kind of leader and person of deep faith and conviction, and then the journalist David Brooks. And when I saw the sites and saw heard these testimonies from people who had been working on HIV/AIDS issues before PEPFAR, and then talked about what it had meant to them in terms of seeing people really come back to life, I think that was an extraordinary experience.
Perfect. And is there anything that you feel I may have missed which you would like to further discuss?
I don't think so. I can't think of anything.
Okay.
That covers it.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to interview with us. We know you really appreciate your voice in this conversation. And we ended it at 12:13, so close ideally to the time you wanted.
Thank you both.
Alrighty.